We are back with Hilary Goodfriend, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the UNAM and a specialist in Central America, a writer and contributor to both Jacobin and Jacobin Latin America, and a member of the Comité de Solidaridad con El Salvador in Mexico, and a much longer list of accomplishments. Thanks again for being with us. In our first hour, we had a very interesting discussion about the differences between Mexico and Central America, how to look at the two regions differently and not just see Central America as an extension of Mexico. We covered the shield of the Americas, which you've called the shame of the Americas, and we came to the joint conclusion that should probably be called the escoria de las Americas, right? What a progressive response could look like in the region to this kind of sham of a summit. And actually we didn't talk about, maybe we could talk about, how the shield of the Americas is, in large part, an attempt to reset the summit of the Americas, which got derailed, in large part because the region rebelled against, countries being left out. And maybe we could talk about that in a minute. I'd like to hear your take on that. We also talked about a lot about the recent elections and meddling in Honduras and Costa Rica, the far right, Nayib Bukele's attempt to kind of franchise his model out from El Salvador, which is obviously in very specific circumstances. We talked about Mexico's strategic leverage and what it could or should be doing with that, and we kind of wound up the first hour talking about Ron Johnson, former U.S. ambassador to El Salvador, and now what's he doing lurking over at that compound over in Polanco, right? Mm-hmm. Because they don't want, the easy protest venue that they used to have when the embassy was on Reforma.
It worked. It worked.
The protests are much smaller over there. I've been to a few. Yep. It did, unfortunately, because it's hard to get to.
It's hard to get to. I haven't gone.
Mm-hmm. But you have to go take the subway and then a bus. Yeah. There's really no other easy way. You take an Uber, and a lot of people are not going to do that. So to start up the second part, here's a question that is worrying both José Luis and myself, and I think a lot of other people, which is you've mentioned that Greg Grandin said with this idea of Latin America and Central America specifically being a laboratory of empire, that after Vietnam, Vietnam syndrome, and the United States was looking for a way to reestablish hard power and, in its sadistic way, feel strong again and proud of itself again. It started, beating up on smaller powers, right? Grenada, and, we know about the Contras, and we know about Nicaragua, and all of that.
The invasion of Panama.
The invasion of Panama. Right now, as we speak, the United States has just gotten itself into another murderous debacle in Iran, and it's getting its tail kicked. So what are the prospects of that for the region in the context of, fanatics like Lindsey Graham going on television in the United States and waving around a cap and saying, after Iran, Cuba's next. And then, one wonders what would be after that if we were to let it, right? So, I guess there are two possibilities. The United States comes back from, Iran bloodied and escarmentado, or it comes back like a wounded dog looking to, beat up on somebody smaller again. That's obviously the worry here. Should we be concerned?
Yes, next question. I think we should remember that the U.S. is already in Ecuador. And I think we shouldn't forget that the U.S. is already engaging in military action in Ecuador. And so the damage is being done, and that escalation could look like a lot of different things. We're already seeing the tensions and potential regional destabilization with regards to Colombia. So I think there's already boots on the ground in that sense. And we already saw the U.S. intervention in Venezuela, right? So it's not as though we're all, waiting to see what's going to happen. Like, it's happening. It's been happening. Going back to Grandin a little bit, he makes this excellent case for the U.S. using Latin America over the decades, if not centuries, as this place to sort of regroup and sort of reconvene its imperialist and expansive agenda. And in the case of, the post-Vietnam era, Reagan and the New Right coalition is really forged in Central America, which is seen as this opportunity to remoralize U.S. military power, right? In a moment when U.S. intervention has been entirely delegitimized, right, in the wake of Vietnam. And that's
how ironic that they wanted to remoralize through all of the torture and devastation they wrought.
Yeah, raping and murdering nuns, right? Mm-hmm. But that was very much the Reagan mission, sure. Right? These the Contras were freedom fighters, right? I mean, that whole counter-revolutionary project.
Equivalent to the founding fathers.
That's right.
Said, right?
That's right. That whole counter-revolutionary project was very much an opportunity for the right to reclaim this high moralized grandstanding that had been the terrain of liberal internationalism, right? And so, and we saw, Bush too very much reclaim that sort of discursive tradition when it came to the invasion of Iraq. The banners of freedom. We were going to be greeted as liberators. It's notable that moral enterprise has been entirely abandoned by this point, right? That's certainly a trademark of Trump too, Trump 1 as well. But at this point, I think there is a lot of cause to concern. There's good reason to feel as though the fate of Cuba depends on the outcome of this military adventure in Iran, which is outrageous, but between that and, the midterms, those are sort of like the two calculations that could either catalyze a more aggressive intervention or end up restraining, the degree to which the United States tries to really force things. And I think that folks are right to identify Cuba as number one in the crosshairs. But of course, Mexico is on the horizon as well. And that's where we're sitting right now. And we know that for a long time, there are factions within the U.S. government who have been chomping at the bit to take more aggressive, military action, against the cartels, whatever on earth that could mean. So certainly, I think that this new scenario of U.S. aggression and, this sort of hegemonic tailspin doesn't bode well for the region, to say the obvious.
Absolutely. I wonder what you think might be some of the more structural reasons behind this, right? Obviously, personalities matter. Marco Rubio in particular, and his thirst for regime change in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, But there's a sense for me anyway that it isn't just about what these individual politicians, actors want to do, but really there's something about the state of the United States and its place in the world, and how much of that actually represents the actual threat, the actual danger behind U.S. foreign policy in this hemisphere.
Sure. I mean, it is hard to understate how much we're all living in like Marco Rubio's fantasy right now. I mean, he has humiliated himself in front of Trump. He has subjected himself to the most egregious insults and just totally debased himself to get to this point in his career and be able to execute this policy at last. And I don't want to discount that because it's just one of those interesting facts of history that he is where he is right now and gets to do this. And I think, a lot of that Venezuelan intervention, a lot of it can be chalked up to the fact that, as I think probably Grandin said, and this is not my line, but that, the road to Havana leads through Caracas, mm-hmm. right? That said, you're right. There's that geopolitical realignment right now. There is a way in which the U.S. in some senses appears to be trying to consolidate its hegemony over the Western Hemisphere, as loosely defined as it is by this administration, because apparently that includes Greenland. But, you know, in an apparent concession to the idea of a multipolar world of, you know, with varying sort of spheres of influence, although as we're seeing with the aggression in Iran, it's hard to say, you know, how much that's like officially the U.S. strategy right now. But it certainly is a path, right? And if that is the path, that could mean a lot more U.S. attention on the region and a lot more efforts to undermine counter-hegemonic tendencies in the region, whether that is the simple fact of, you know, China being the region's largest trading partner, regardless of the ideology of you know, governing parties across the hemisphere, or, you know, actually, you know, progressive leaders trying to implement progressive policy, you know, and kind of, you know, maybe optimistically delink, you know, decouple themselves from their subordinate integration into like these U.S.-led accumulation patterns and security initiatives in the region. So that is one possible outcome. At the same time, we appear to be just, and by we, I mean the U.S. government appears to just be barreling towards further bogging itself down in perpetual conflict in the Middle East, in which case, I don't really know. I don't think they do either, you know.
Well, that's the question, right? Because a few months ago, there was the new National Security Directive, and it was supposedly going to be a repivot to the Americas, at least a temporary repivot to provision itself of minerals and resources to then maybe go back out and, you know, reestablish hegemony.
That was definitely my hypothesis. Right? I talked about it a bunch.
But it seems like they kind of just
and then
bolted on that and jumped that, and they didn't even do the Americas repivot before going off to Iran.
Yeah, and
wasn't it supposed to be setting up for China at some point?
Yeah, we were before that. We were pivoting to Asia. You know, we've been pivoting to Asia for decades at this point, and yet, you know, here we are in Iran again. That's exactly.
Pivot after pivot.
Yeah. So indeed, I mean, the incoherence of the policy, I think, is really important, because I always push back. You know, there's a tendency, I think, sometimes on the Latin American left to see the U.S. as this kind of unparalleled conspiratorial force, which it certainly is. But this idea that everything is part of a grand imperialist strategy. Mm-hmm. And while there are certainly elements within the U.S. state that are always part of a, you know, they are always conspiring imperialistly, that is not the same as, you know, Trump meticulously carrying out, you know, a 17-move chess play. That's not what's happening right now. That's certainly not what's happening right now. So I think that factor of chaos and instability, it's important to recognize.
You're right, too, because sometimes people in Latin America say, but the chaos is part of the chess, or the instability is part of the chess. And I think those of us who grew up or spent time in the U.S. can have that insight to say, no, sometimes they're just idiots.
Yeah, sometimes they're just idiots.
Sometimes they're just idiots.
Which is not to say that there aren't other actors within the U.S. state who can't try and find ways to leverage that chaos, to take advantage of the instability. But it's not the same thing.
Yeah. And in some ways, the chaos has actually been a constant, right?
Yeah. Sure.
Certainly. And speaking of chaos, one of the things that I've lately been thinking a lot about is the economic fallout about everything that's happening and what it's going to mean for this region. Because I think wealthy nations will likely weather it as they have other recessions. I think we're at the doorstep of a recession. But lower income countries, middle income countries can't. You know, there is, I think, going to be a lot of belt tightening by even progressive governments, right? So I wanted to hear your thoughts in terms of what you think might happen in terms of the economic fallout with the energy crisis, which is already upon us, right? I mean, this is not really the object of this program, but we should be aware, right, that there's a huge gap in terms of global demand for oil and the supply in this moment because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Mexico, in a lot of ways, is energy independent, except for when it comes to gas, which is one of the major things that's not coming out of that region right now. And what is that going to mean for the government coffers here in Mexico? Sure, we can sell more barrels of oil at a higher price, above $100 a barrel, but we're buying natural gas at far more expensive
And how
price.
ironic to that point that during the Fox administration they were letting gas flare off at Cantadel, right? Just tons and tons of gas,
Absolutely.
letting it flare off.
Yeah. And I think there's other faults. There may be a push for fracking in Mexico as a result of the need to feel like there is a sufficient domestic supply, et cetera, et cetera. So I know it's a huge question, but in terms of specifically around economics and what kind of pressure a squeezing of the purse strings might actually have on these handful of progressive governments that are left in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one would hope that it will also catalyze that, fabled transition to renewables, which I know is a long-term bet, but this is a really, really serious issue. Certainly, we talked about what strategic leverage does Mexico have, and the fact that the USMCA, the sort of new NAFTA, the free trade, or not, we're not supposed to call it a free trade agreement anymore, right? The trade agreement, those are underway right now. Certainly, and I mentioned, I do think that this is an opportunity for Mexican negotiators to reposition once more the region as this nearshoring platform amid supply chain chaos. Mexico can once again, demonstrate its relative stability and proximity, to U.S. markets as a point in its favor. Whether or not we really want to favor that development model, I think it's something to take into account. I do think it's actually this could be a point of leverage for Mexico in this kind of negotiation. For the rest of the region, it's a lot more complex. You asked about progressive governments, but I'm also thinking about in Central America, the dependency on remittances is much greater than it is in Mexico. Obviously, Mexico receives a much higher dollar amount because there are just a lot more Mexicans in the United States. But remittances are maybe 4% of Mexican GDP. I haven't looked at the most recent figures. And, in Northern Central America, they are above 20%. They are around 25%, right? Maquiladora exports have been stagnant or declining since the Great Recession, and declining since even earlier. The impacts of a recession in the U.S. have multiplying effects, right, in these countries because of that subordinate integration. Mexico is better positioned to weather it, but is obviously vulnerable. But a country like El Salvador that's dollarized can't even manipulate its own currency in response to these kinds of system shocks. Panama also uses the dollar. Ecuador also uses the dollar. It'll be interesting to see what the results of further economic crisis, politically look like in the region, but there's no reason to assume that they'll be positive. And certainly for countries like, Brazil and Colombia, in a moment like this, China looks like an increasingly attractive trading partner, especially with the kind of what's the word? Capriciousness of the Trump administration when it comes to trade, fickleness, when it comes to the tariffs and whatnot. So, these sorts of crises can be opportunities, to pivot, as you suggested. But I think they largely just sort of reveal the weaknesses of these economic structures of accumulation that remain so deeply integrated into this U.S.-led system.
I was going to say one of my worries about that in particular is something that actually you had referenced earlier, which is the demobilization that has happened, and it's happened pretty much throughout the continent. Right? There isn't powerful social movements really to speak of. I mean, obviously the trade union movement in Argentina, the MST in Brazil, right? Like there are some, notable exceptions, but I think generally what we have seen is a general demobilization. And without that, these opportunities go to waste, or they feed into that cynicism, that depoliticization that is fuel for a far right actor or movement to take over. And I think that's really the most worrisome part. And in a lot of ways, I think El Salvador can kind of teach us what happens when there is that demobilization. Yet you end up leaving so much room. It's wide open for the far right to really take over.
That's right. And of course, and now the folks who remain in the streets and are confronting the regime head on are basically alone, in their fight and facing just this massive apparatus of state repression. So certainly, yeah, it's formidable. I mean, I think about it in the U.S. context as well. This war is one of the least popular in history, right? And yet we don't see even the level of mobilization that we saw in the lead up to Iraq. Obviously, this happened a lot quicker. The Trump administration did not spend, a year making its case to the U.S. public, right? So they are different conditions, but it is troubling. And, the massive repression that the movement for freedom in Palestine faced, we're seeing the consequences of that now. And so I think that trend of sort of anti-politics that the far right has been riding into office, it has that effect, of demoralizing people, not just demobilizing them, but demoralizing them. And it's also there's reason to point to U.S. destabilization strategies in the region in the form of lawfare and other kind of electoral reform and judicial strategies that they've been pushing and that they pushed hard in countries like El Salvador to depoliticize politics under the guise of sort of like technocratic reforms, to depoliticize governance. And to weaken the role of traditional political parties in governance, parties that used to represent a project. And so when you would vote for a party, you would vote for an agenda and incentivizing individual candidacies, incentivizing people's faces on ballots, incentivizing, people being able to run their own campaigns, right, which opens the room for, self-financing and all of the inequities that suggests. So that whole trend that the U.S. Embassy and USAID and all of its tentacles were advancing in the region for the last 20 years or so, especially under Democratic administrations, has borne fruit in sort of demobilizing people, in making politics less interesting, in making it a professional career choice, right, and not a historical project of reform and transformation.
Now that USAID is supposedly was temporarily, yes, not closed, what does that bode for what you just said? Obviously, those kind of efforts that were born out of USAID and National Endowment for Democracy are not going to go away, but they take other forms. Are they just more discretional forms coming out of the State Department?
It's very interesting. I think about it in the Central American context where USAID, I would say for better and for worse, but mostly just for worse, was a huge employer in the region. With neoliberal restructuring, the entire sort of like mass front popular movement structures that had been such an important base for the revolutionary movements in the region were largely sort of NGO-ized, and the NGO form became one of the main ways that a lot of people could advance, be it a union agenda, a feminist agenda, and so a lot of the sort of civil society sector became a massive, not just source of obviously all kinds of nefarious, meddling, but also a place where a lot of it was sort of the only space where certain kinds of politics, from which certain kinds of politics could like happen. And like I said, a massive source of employment. So the impacts of the USAID cuts in like Guatemala was, I think, the principal receptor of USAID in the hemisphere. And El Salvador was not far behind. The impacts just in terms of employment have been devastating in terms of journalists, but also just kind of all kinds of services and different movement groups. And it is kind of shocking to see the U.S. Government be so dismissive of its own soft power when that soft power has been so effective, at undermining more revolutionary strategies for change and sometimes, and being outright instruments for really nefarious intervention. So it's interesting. Obviously, there are other channels, for that money. And, Bukele, because he's friends with Trump, at least is now conveniently, he doesn't have to rail against USAID. He can just point to Soros, right? Mm-hmm. But I do think that it's notable, and I think it's notable that the U.S. has sort of shrugged off its soft power and is really just seems to assume that blunt military force can take care of the rest.
Which can be good news for the Latin American left, can't it? I mean, fuera máscaras, as AMLO say, right?
That's right.
Without all these kind of hypnotizing effects of NGO-ism. Things are very clear now. It's like a teachable moment, as I say.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly one way to look at it. And I think, that dependency on foreign aid, not just USAID, but also, European cooperation and the like, was always debilitating and hugely problematic, even in the best cases, So it's interesting, I imagine that our U.S. audience can't really imagine the dimensions of the space that kind of foreign aid takes up in civil society in countries in Latin America that have been restructured in the way that the countries like El Salvador and Central America have been. But it's really remarkable. And that rug pull was, shocking, frankly. Yeah.
It was interesting also to see the outlets that basically shut down afterwards, when one day to the next, it's like, oh, okay, now we know. Or even people who position themselves as radicals, certainly here in Mexico, who are like, oh, we have to fundraise now because, the project I was leading doesn't have any funding. It's like, well, where was your funding coming from, right?
That's right.
But anyway, I think really one of the things that we've been stressing has been like, yes, mobilizing is important, but organizing has to be part of the equation now. It can't be for a future moment. The organizing has to happen now. Because I also think there's got to be a backlash coming, right? Like you said, if you abandon all of your soft power and you're strictly relying on kind of brutal strength, eventually people get sick of the bully, right? But we have to make sure that the institutions, the structures, the movements, whatever you want to call it, are there to grab people and channel that energy correctly, not into NGOs, not into strictly an electoral project, but actually organizing against imperialism.
That's right. Yeah, and I think, Central America has some excellent models for that. I return again to the example of the heroic work in Honduras, in the wake of the coup, the movement for refoundation, that Popular Front strategy was incredibly effective. And they successfully leveraged it into a political party that did win the presidency. And then here we are,
And then the logic of electoralism kind of took over.
That's right.
That was certainly my sense. That was what I was able to pick up actually quite easily from the population, right? Like you didn't really have to probe much to realize people were like, well, we were disappointed, right? We were promised one thing and we got another. And then, things like the familion, right? This idea that you were meant to refound the state and you ultimately just kind of created a clique that centralized power in their hands. And it was really disappointing. Yeah. And I think that kind of criticism, I got a lot of pushback on my coverage of that from people saying, well, you weren't fair enough to leave it at. No, I was telling you what people were telling me. It was obvious the day I landed that they were going to have a hard time getting reelected, despite what the polls were saying at the time.
Absolutely. And that was on the horizon. So I haven't been back to Honduras since around 2000. I think it was in like the summer of 2001. It was after the election, but that, Libre was just, really sort of like taking off in office. And those were the concerns everyone had, and we had seen it play out in El Salvador to a different degree with a much stronger party apparatus, with which to staff a government, which is another concern, you can exhaust, people talk about co-option, but sometimes you just need cadre to serve in key positions in the state,
That was part of AMLO's problem in his first couple of years.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. It's a huge issue. Yeah. And with a massive state apparatus like Mexico, it's no small thing. So certainly these are the challenges, and these are the contradictions of left governments. But I would return to that sort of word of caution that I mentioned before, which is there's a way in which, in the effort to not, amid like this just savage destabilization, that progressive governments face, there is a temptation to moderate in order to stay in power, because the logic is, well, if I take another step, there's going to be a coup, which it might not be a wrong calculation, and so in order to try and continue this project, we need to moderate, But that's the same logic that can end up with a backlash from the base, and you end up ousted and delegitimized, and you have a scenario like the scenario in El Salvador.
Interestingly enough, though, I would say that the case of Mexico was actually a move to the left, which
absolutely
consolidated the base and actually expanded the tent, growing in support. And I think arguably what Colombia and the Pacto Histórico there is doing is also clearly, like, they could have picked a centrist VP. And who did they pick? No, somebody from the indigenous communities who's been a long-time social activist, right? So in some ways, hopefully, those are signs that people are learning the lessons.
That's right. That's right.
But in Mexico, like you were just saying with regards to Libre, they did take the risk of raising expectations, because it's a risk, right? Because it rallies people from the campaign. AMLO promised a fourth transformation on par with, the revolution and the reform era and insurgentes. I mean, no small matter.
That's right.
Right. But then you have to, deliver it to that degree of rhetoric.
Yeah, but you can't campaign on continuity.
Yeah.
You can't. I mean, that's not enough. It's not enough because it's
around the edges.
It's a conservative proposal. It's conservation of the status quo, and in a country like Mexico, where the president's term is 6 years, you've got a whole generation of voters who've only known, Morena governance. So it's imperative to be constantly pushing, and it is heartening to see, at least from my perspective, the pace with which this government has been rolling out, these massive infrastructure developments and social investments and the like. I think it's encouraging.
No wasting time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think this might be a good place to stop.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't want to take up too much more of your time. It's been really great, really instructive, very illuminating for our audience. We really appreciate it. And we have a tradition here in El Taller, Hilary, that everybody gets a product of the workshop itself.
Oh, wow.
Yes, for those of you who are new to El Taller, this is the first time watching, this is actual workshop.
This is an actual functioning taller.
Where things are made.
Mm-hmm.
This is beautiful.
Yes, it's actually made by our producer who's behind the camera right now.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a nice reminder that, of what labor actually is, right? Your hands transforming material goods into new things, and so it's a nice place where we also play with the idea of, like, we workshop ideas. So this has been a fantastic conversation. I always actually kind of figured that it was kind of be the conversations we have when we meet up with each other and kind of really get into it. And this time we happen to have a couple of mics in front of us.
That's right.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks,
likewise. Thanks a lot.
And now that we're back on track with El Taller after a brief hiatus, expect more of this. This episode is coming out in the week we have off because of our 100th episode and Semana Santa and the like. But we're going to be back with the regular Soberanía and, of course, the regular at least monthly talleres. So be looking for those. And as always, like, share, and subscribe. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell people who you think might be interested in this and knowing more about Mexico, Central America, Latin America, through a lens of people who've been on both sides of the border, and with some wonderful guests as with today.
Yeah. So we'll put some of Hilary's most recent publications in the description, and I really highly recommend you follow all of her work, because it's one of the few people out there who's actually covering Central America, a region that is often ignored, but as we just finished seeing, has lessons for all of us throughout the world.
Where can people find your work?
I mean, I hate to say it, but you can follow me on Twitter. Yeah, at Hilary Goodfriend.
Okay.
Sounds good.
And we will see you again very soon en Soberanía and en Taller. Thanks for joining us.
Take care.
Recordamos a esos políticos hipócritas e irresponsables que México es un país independiente y libre, no una colonia ni un protectorado de Estados Unidos.